The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. As they were coming down the mountain, the disciples asked Jesus, "Why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" He said in reply, "Elijah will indeed come and restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come." And they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they pleased. So also will the Son of Man suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. The Gospel of the Lord. Today's readings, we hear about two awesome prophets, Elijah and John the Baptist, and both of them call people to conversion, to turning away from sin and turning toward God, to return to God. And in our first reading, they talk not only to the people of their times, but they're also talking to us. So it's through Scriptures they continue to speak to us through God. God speaks to us through Scripture to turn away from sin and turn toward God. So in that first reading, we hear about Elijah. And Elijah means Yahweh is my God. And it's very appropriate because he lived about was doing his prophecies about 850 years before Christ. And it was during the reign of King Ahab, the worst king ever, in Israel. And his queen was Jezebel, who was she was a pagan, and she brought pagan practices into Israel. And between Ahab and Jezebel, they systematically killed all the prophets in Israel and set up, except Elijah, and set up, altars for the false god. And Baal was the big one, B-A-A-L, Baal. And it didn't even include child sacrifice. And so in order to call people to conversion, to a chastisement, to wake them up that there is a God, Elijah calls down a drought for 3 years. And of course the king's got this order out to kill him on sight, so Elijah hides. At the end of the 3 years he comes out and he brings rain, but he challenges the prophets of Baal, like 400 of them, to a sacrificial duel. So it's like each side gets to prepare a sacrifice and put a bull up there, and then you call on your God to light the fire. You don't light it, you call on your God to light the fire. And of course, Elijah's sacrifice is all drenched in water because he's so confident that God will respond. The Baal prophets dance around for 4 hours, nothing happens, Elijah says one thing to God and asking him to send down fire, and it's so intense and so hot that even the stones, they say, turn to dust, And then the people that are watching this, then they realize that there's only one God, and it's the God of Elijah. It's Yahweh. He is their God. And so the people's hearts began to turn back toward God from the false prophets that were introduced to him. And Elijah doesn't die. He's not buried. There's no graves with a headstone for him. This fiery chariot comes out of the sky. He had crossed the Jordan River with his successor, Elisha, and the chariot picks him up and he goes back up into the sky. And then 400 years after that, the prophet Malachi prophesies that Elijah will return before the Messiah comes. And so this is locked into all the Jews. They remember this. And then in our reading today from Sirach, 200 years later from that, about 200 years before Christ, he reminds them of that prophecy. And so Elijah is this great prophet. And you don't mess with Elijah. Okay? And so in our gospel, it's just after the transfiguration. So Peter, James, and John were up on Mount Tabor with Jesus, and they saw him, his glory, so it means his godliness, and they're walking down the mountain. and they're processing what they've seen. And they know the prophecy that Elijah is going to return. And so they're doubting that Jesus is this Messiah. And so they said, isn't Elijah supposed to return? And Jesus says two things to them. One is that Elijah did return in the spirit of John the Baptist, but people did not recognize him. And about 2 or 3 chapters before, he had his head chopped off by Herod. And then the second thing that Jesus says is that the Son of Man, in other words, Jesus, is going to suffer a similar fate. In other words, he's going to die at the hand of the Romans in a very cruel death. And so thinking about that, today we should remember to respond to those two great heralds, Elijah and John the Baptist, calling us to convert, to turn away from sin and turn toward God. And so we should ask God, through the intercession of Mary, for the graces that we need for conversion, to open up our hearts so that Jesus can enter our hearts and we can walk in Jesus' way.